there, welcome back to Young Child Therapy. I'm Hayden, and today we're going to dive deep into something that many of us experience but hardly talk about, the hidden cost of perfectionism. We've all heard the saying, strive for excellence, but how many of us actually strive for something more perfection? We set these impossibly high standards, and when we don't meet them, we often feel like failures. The thing is, perfectionism isn't something you can see on the surface. It's subtle, it builds up over time, and it impacts us in a way that we rarely acknowledge. So, in today's episode, we'll explore why perfectionism often goes unspoken, how it shows up in our lives, and why so many of us feel the need to stay silent about it. We'll also talk about the toll it takes on our mental health, relationship, and overall well-being. If you're someone who often feels the weight of perfectionism, or if you know someone who does, this is an important conversation, so let's get into it. Let's start with a simple but critical question. What is perfectionism? Most people think it's about having high standards, of wanting to do your best, and sure, on the surface, that's part of it. But perfectionism is a deeper, more insidious drive. It's about setting such high standards that you can't possibly meet them all the time. Perfectionism isn't just about wanting to do well, it's about needing to be flawless constantly. It's like living with a constant voice in the back of your head telling you that you're only as good as your last accomplishment. When you're a perfectionist, every mistake, every tiny mistake feels like a personal failure. The smallest error can feel like catastrophic. But this isn't limited to big, obvious mistakes. It's also the everyday little things. A missed email, a delayed project, a conversation that didn't go as smoothly as you hoped. These small imperfections can spiral into a much larger problem, making you feel like you're never truly good enough. From a psychological perspective, perfectionism often stems from self-worth issues. Studies show that perfectionists tend to have an intense fear of failure. In fact, psychologists like Dr. Gordon Flett and Dr. Paul Hewitt, two experts in perfectionist research, explain that perfectionists are driven by fear of not measuring up to their own standards or the expectations set by others. They argue that this fear of imperfection can lead to chronic anxiety and can also result in depression when the standards are unmet, which is very, very scary. But the journey irony here is that perfectionists are often lauded for their hard work and achievements, which can make them feel even more isolated. We're praised for our successes, but nobody sees the inner struggle, the anxiety, the pressure, the fear of not messing up. And because nobody sees it, it's easy to assume that everyone else has it all together. This creates a cycle of isolation where we feel like we're the only one dealing with these struggles. So, why do perfectionists stay quiet about it? It's kind of hard to admit that we're struggling under the weight of perfectionism. This is where things get more complicated. There's an unspoken expectations in society, especially in the age of social media, that success should look effortless. When we post our accomplishment, whether it's a new job, a fitness milestone, or an academic achievement, it's carefully curated to highlight only the positives. The struggle, the late night, the internal battles we fought to get there, those aren't visible. And when we see other people's success stories without the behind the scene challenges, it feeds into the idea that we should have it all together too. This is where sociology plays a key role. In sociology, we talk about social comparison theory, which explain that people determine their own social and personal worth based on how they stack up against others. The drive to appear perfect on social media, in the workplace, or in our social circle is heavily influenced by the social norm and expectations that surround us. So Irving Goffman, a sociologist, called this process impression management, where we shape the way others perceive us to fit into the societal standards. If we can meet those standards, we often choose silence over vulnerability. So on top of that, many of us are raised with the belief that vulnerability equals weakness. If we talk about imperfection, our setbacks or our struggles we fear will be judged or seen as less competent, less capable, or even less worthy. But here's the thing, our imperfections are what makes us human. It's the messy, uncertain parts of life that we cannot connect over, learn from, and grow through. But if we keep quiet about them, we don't give ourselves or other the space to heal. A powerful example of this is Brené Brown's research on vulnerability. She found that people who embrace vulnerability rather than trying to maintain a facade of perfection actually experience deeper connection and resilience. But admitting that we're not perfect requires courage. And for many of us, that's hard to find when society pushes us to hide our flaws. The silence surrounding perfectionism doesn't just isolate us, it keeps the cycle of self doubt and anxiety spinning. The more we stay quiet, the more pressure we feel to maintain the facade of perfection. But it's unsustainable. Alright, so let's talk about something that doesn't always get mentioned when we discuss perfectionism, the physical toll it takes on our brain and body. Neuroscience can actually help us understand why perfectionism is so emotionally and physically draining. Perfectionism activates two parts of our brain, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for higher order thinking, planning, and decision making. It's also the area that kicks into high gear when we're working hard to meet a goal or standards. When we constantly push ourselves to meet unrealistically high standards, the prefrontal cortex is working overtime. This can lead to mental fatigue, burnout, and even decreased cognitive function over time. On the other hand, the amygdala is our brain's fear and stress center. And when we don't meet our perfectionist goals, the amygdala gets activated. This results in anxiety, stress, and feelings of inadequacy. I forgot the word. If this cycle continues long enough, it can lead to chronic anxiety, depression, and even physical issues like insomnia and digestive problems. In short, perfectionism doesn't just mess with our minds, it messes with our bodies too. So, neuroscientific studies have shown that perfectionism can even affect brain oh my gosh, plasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and change. So, one study found that when people are stressed or anxious, like when perfectionism causes us to overthink, it can slow down neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons in the brain. This means we may not just be hurting ourselves in the present, but also limiting our ability to grow mentally and emotionally in the future. When we constantly strive for perfection, we're not just pushing our minds, we're also pushing our nervous system into overdrive. And all of this can lead to a constant state of flight or flight where we're always on edge, waiting for the next thing to go wrong. This is why perfectionism is so exhausting and why so many of us feel burnt out even when we seem to be successful on the outside. Okay, So we've talked about perfectionism is so harmful and why we tend to stay quiet about it. But how do we break the silence? How do we start healing from perfectionism? So first of all, acknowledge it. A lot of time we think we can just push through, but perfectionism doesn't work that way. The first step is recognizing that perfectionism is having an impact on your life. Once you admit it, you can begin to change it. Next, practice self compassion. This is huge. We're often our own harshest, I mean, harshest critiques. And we need to learn how to talk to ourselves the way we would talk to a friend who is struggling. Perfectionism tells us we're not good enough, but self compassion helps us realize that we're enough even with our imperfections. A good way to practice it is through mindfulness and self reflection. When you make a mistake, instead of berating yourself, ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Start talking about it. I know this can be hard, especially if you've been keeping your struggles under wrap for a long time. Opening about your perfectionism can be incredibly freeing. Find someone you trust, whether it's a friend, a partner, or a therapist, and share your experience. You might be surprised at how many others are struggling with the same thing. Breaking the silence around perfectionism is essential. The more we talk about it, the less power it has over us. So let's wrap this up. The long term effects of living with perfectionism and how to truly embrace imperfection. Let's be clear, perfectionism doesn't just go away overnight. It's a deeply ingrained pattern of thinking, and it takes time to unlearn, but that's okay. The goal isn't to become perfect and letting go perfectionism, it's to start giving yourself permission to be imperfect. It's about letting go of the need to be flawless all the time and embracing the messiness of life. When you stop trying to be perfect, you open up space for joy, creativity, and authentic connection. You can show up as your true self, flaws and all. So, research also have shown that when we embrace imperfection, we experience greater satisfaction in our life. A study by Dr. Christine Neff, a leading researcher in the field of self compassion, showed that people who practice self compassion are more resilient, happier, and less likely to experience anxiety or depression. The key is learning to accept that success doesn't have to be flawless. It's the learning process, the growth, the setbacks, and the resilience that makes success meaningful. And in the end, the journey to success is always more important than the final destination. That's all for today's episode. I hope this conversations help you recognize that the toll perfectionism might be taking on your life, and that is encourages you to start breaking the silence and embracing your true self, imperfections and all. If you're struggling with perfectionism, remember that you're not alone and there's no shame in asking for help. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe and share it with anyone who might need to hear it. Let's start a conversation. It's time to silence the voice of perfectionism and make space for imperfectionism. All right, thank you for tuning in. Take care and remember, being imperfect is what makes us human.